How does a woman who endured betrayal, violence, and unbearable loss become radiant sign of mercy in a wounded world? Welcome, dear friends, wherever you are listening tonight. May this gentle space bring peace to your heart. Settle in, feel at home, and kindly subscribe before our story begins now. This is the journey of Saint Rita, a woman shaped by sorrow and transformed by grace, whose path through violence, forgiveness, and mystical suffering reveals how a fragile heart can become a beacon of impossible hope for all who seek. It is in the soft light of an Umbrian morning, with the hills rolling in quiet folds, and the air holding that fragile stillness before the day fully begins, that the story of Saint Rita truly opens, not with thunder or triumph, but with the gentle cry of a newborn who would one day be known as the patroness of impossible causes. To imagine her first breath is to imagine a whisper offered into a world shaped by both beauty and conflict, a world where the peace she would come to embody was desperately needed. Little Margherita Lotti, later known simply as Rita, was born around 1381 in the small village of Roccaporena near Cascia, a place wrapped in rugged stone and humble rhythms. Her parents, Antonio and Amata, were already advanced in age when she arrived, and perhaps for this reason alone, they cherished her with an affection mixed with awe, as though they sensed, without fully understanding, that her life would not be an ordinary one. They were known in their community as peacemakers, people called upon to help mend disputes among neighbors and families. How tenderly they must have looked upon this unexpected child, believing she had been given to them not simply for their joy, but for the quiet work God would someday ask of her. From the beginning, Rita's life seemed soaked in grace, though those around her would only recognize it in gentle signs. There is the old story, told and retold through generations, of bees gathering around her cradle without stinging her. They say that the bees drifted into her room, carrying small droplets of honey, as if honoring a soul whose sweetness would one day be known far beyond the hills of Umbria. Whether one takes the story literally or symbolically, it carries a truth about her nature. Rita was born into stillness, into a kind of interior harmony that felt rare in a turbulent age. As she grew, she preferred the quiet corners of her home to the bustling fields where other children played. She would often slip away to the small stone church nearby, kneeling in the dim coolness and letting the silence wrap around her like a shawl. In those early hours of prayer, she was not seeking miracles or grand visions. She was seeking God in the way a flower seeks the sun, gently, naturally, instinctively. How could her parents not marvel at this child who asked for so little, and yet seemed content with so much? Life in 14th century Italy was not simple. The region was marked by political feuds, shifting alliances, and families divided by long-standing rivalries. Even in small villages like Roccaporena, people breathed the tension of these conflicts, as one breathes the wind, something ever-present, even if unseen. Perhaps this is why Antonio and Amata longed so deeply for peace, both in their home and in their community. And perhaps this is why they hoped for their daughter to grow in the virtues that could anchor a life amid chaos. Rita absorbed everything with a quiet attentiveness, the way her parents mediated disputes, the way they offered kindness without expecting repayment, the way they treated wounded pride or anger with patience. These lessons, gathered in her heart like small stones carried in a pocket, would become the foundation of her later strength. Still, even in her innocence, a question begins to form like a faint shadow at the edge of light. How long can a soul remain untouched by suffering in a world so marked by it? And how does God prepare a child for a future that will demand more courage than most lives ever require. For though Rita's early years glowed with gentleness, they also prepared her, quietly and tenderly, for the tremendous crosses she would one day bear. From a young age, Rita felt drawn to the idea of religious life. She watched the Augustinian nuns in Cascia with wide, admiring eyes, noticing the quiet dignity with which they carried themselves, the serenity that seemed to settle over their veils like morning dew. In her heart, she felt the stirrings of a vocation, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a steady, peaceful pull. She imagined herself within those stone walls, dedicating every breath to prayer, charity, and union with God. Often she would confide these hopes in prayer, speaking softly into the spaces where she felt God listening. But as she grew older, she also became aware of the expectations around her, expectations shaped by tradition, necessity, and the customs of a time when daughters rarely chose their path freely. Her parents, advanced in age, depended on her presence. And though they saw her holiness, they also saw the practical need to secure her future through marriage, as they had done for countless generations before. Yet for now, in these early years, the tension between her longing and her duty had not yet tightened. She remained their only child, their joy, their consolation. She spent her days helping her mother in the home, tending to simple tasks with the quiet devotion that would become one of her defining traits. Whether she was baking bread, gathering herbs, or mending household garments, she infused her actions with prayer, like someone weaving a silent tapestry no one else could see. Her father, proud of her gentleness, would sometimes call her his little peacemaker, not knowing just how prophetic that simple nickname would one day become. Often, as dusk settled and the last light faded behind the hills, Rita would stand outside the family's small home and watch the sky stretch into deep blues and purples. She would breathe in the scent of earth cooling after the heat of the day, and she would let her heart rest in the simple truth of being loved. It is easy to imagine her in those moments, young, hopeful, unaware of the storms that lay ahead, as someone whose soul was quietly aligning itself with God's will long before she understood the cost of such alignment. Perhaps God was looking upon her even then, seeing not just the child before him, but the saint she would one day become, forged not in ease but in fire, shaped not by comfort but by loss and forgiveness. And so we continue from the quiet cradle of Rita's early years, where innocence and prayer formed the gentle rhythm of her days, moving now into the tender unfolding of her girlhood, a time when her heart seemed to grow in two directions at once, toward the familiar warmth of her parents' home, and toward the deeper, mysterious calling that stirred whenever she knelt before the tabernacle in Cascia. It is here, in this middle place between childhood and the first shadows of adulthood, that her longing for God gains shape, not with thunder or visions, but with the steady pulse of desire, the kind that rises like incense from a soul that simply wants to belong entirely to the one who made her. Rita began to visit the small church in Roccaporena more often as she grew older. The stone walls, always cool and faintly scented with beeswax and moss, became her refuge. She would slip inside during the quiet hours when no one else was there, crossing herself with a slow tenderness before taking her place near the altar. In those moments, the world beyond the church door faded, and even her own hopes and fears seemed to settle into stillness. What did she pray for during those long hours? Perhaps for guidance, or for the grace to understand the stirrings in her heart. Or perhaps she simply rested, basking in the presence of God with the trust of a child leaning against a loving parent. Her devotion did not make her aloof from ordinary life. She learned the daily tasks expected of a young woman in that time, helping her mother churn butter, weave linen, tend the small garden behind their home, and carry water from the communal fountain. She did everything with the same gentleness that marked her prayers, as though each action, no matter how small, was another way of praising God. Her parents noticed this quiet depth in her. They saw how she worked without complaint, how she soothed neighbors during petty disputes, how she instinctively turned to prayer whenever something troubled her. Sometimes, in the evenings, her father would pause in the doorway and watch her as she sat sewing by the hearth, her face calm in the flickering firelight, and he would wonder what plans God might have for a soul so attuned to peace. Yet even as they cherished her, they also lived with an unspoken worry. Antonio and Amata were elderly, far older than most parents around them. They knew they could not protect her forever, nor could they hold her close as childhood slipped away. In those days, girls were expected to marry, to strengthen family bonds, or to secure their future through a husband's household. Rita, however, felt drawn toward another future entirely. From the time she first saw the Augustinian sisters walking through Cascia, moving like quiet shadows of prayer beneath their veils, something in her heart quickened. She saw in their lives a path stripped of conflict and worldly ambition, a life shaped by silence, charity, study, and devotion. Whenever she visited Cascia with her parents, she found herself glancing at the convent walls, wondering what lay behind them, and whether she might someday walk through those gates. But while Rita's heart leaned toward God, her parents began to lean toward plans of their own. They loved her too deeply to give her up easily, especially in a world where peace was fragile and young women were vulnerable. And so, when she approached them with her desire to enter religious life, they listened gently but firmly reminded her that marriage, respectable, practical, and expected, was the path set before her. Rita obeyed because obedience had always been the first language of her love. Yet inside her, something shifted, like a small bird trapped behind window glass. She tried to silence the longing for the convent, to fold it neatly and place it behind the more pressing duties at home. But the longing did not leave. It remained quiet, steady, patient. She grew into a young woman of striking humility, someone whose beauty shone not in her features, though many said she was lovely, but in the way she carried peace like a mantle. Neighbors sought her out to help soothe quarrels, praising her calm voice and gentle gaze. She became known for her ability to listen without judgment, to offer wise words without pride. Some said she seemed older than her years in wisdom, yet younger in purity. Around this time, an event occurred that many later viewed as a sign of her sanctity. One summer, as she was tending to chores outside, a swarm of white bees gathered once again, years after the first miracle near her cradle. They moved around her silently, neither alarming nor harming her, drifting in and out of her hands as though drawn to the sweetness of her soul. Rita, absorbed in her work, barely noticed them. It was her neighbors who stood in awe. They would remember that sight for the rest of their lives, whispering that God Himself marked her as His own. Yet signs, no matter how wondrous, do not always shield a life from suffering. And though her childhood was steeped in peace, the shadows of future trials were already lengthening across the horizon, quietly preparing to shape her destiny. As her parents aged further, Rita became more protective of them, caring for them with a tenderness that sprang from gratitude. She loved them deeply, and the thought of leaving them filled her with sorrow. But her heart still yearned for the religious life, even though she buried this desire beneath layers of duty. How often she must have asked God in her silent prayers, "What do you want of me? Do you call me to your convent? Or do you ask me to remain here in obedience, even if my soul aches for another path?" The answer did not come in words. It came in the slow unfolding of events, in the glances exchanged between her parents, in the gentle pressure to consider a suitor, and in the unmistakable realization that the life she longed for would never be hers, at least not yet. And so, Part 2 ends on a tender question, one that hovers like a soft echo in the quiet chambers of her heart. When a soul longs for God alone, how does it accept the path that leads in another direction? The years ahead would reveal the painful, transformative truth of that question, though Rita could not see it yet. And so we move gently from the tender longing of Rita's youthful heart into the turning point that would shape the entire course of her life, a moment when dreams quietly surrendered to duty, and a peaceful girl who once gazed longingly toward the convent walls found herself instead standing at the threshold of marriage. The story continues like a slow river bending unexpectedly, its course determined not by desire, but by the landscape around it. And Rita, shaped by obedience and love for her aging parents, stepped into a future she had not chosen, trusting that God would somehow remain near even when the path felt foreign beneath her feet. Her parents, Antonio and Amata, had begun to worry more openly as they grew increasingly frail. The lines on their faces deepened, not just from years of labor, but from the anxiety of leaving their beloved daughter alone in a world marked by feuds, danger, and instability. They loved her too deeply to risk her vulnerability, too tenderly to imagine her without the protection of a husband's household. And though they sensed her quiet longing for religious life, they believed firmly, perhaps desperately, that arranging a marriage was an act of care. Rita, ever obedient, accepted their decision with humility. She did not protest, though her heart trembled with sorrow at the thought of abandoning her dream of the convent. She prayed more fervently than ever during this time, asking God to steady her spirit, to help her accept whatever He permitted, even if it felt like a tearing inside her. Little did she know that this surrender, painful as it was, would prepare her for the unimaginable trials that lay ahead. The man chosen for her was Paolo Mancini, a young officer and member of a prominent local family. In a region plagued by political conflict and bitter vendettas, Paolo's position was both respected and feared. He came from a lineage entangled in the violent tensions that divided Cascia, a world far removed from Rita's gentle upbringing. Those who spoke of him described a man of great courage, but also a man quick to anger, shaped by the harsh expectations placed upon him as a soldier and a member of a restless, prideful clan. Some whispered that he carried shadows in his eyes, remnants of battles both on the field and within his own heart. Yet for Rita's parents, he offered stability, security, and the promise that she would not be left unprotected after their passing. Rita met him only briefly before the marriage was arranged. She saw in him not a villain, but a man hardened by the world, someone who had learned to survive through strength rather than gentleness. Perhaps she hoped she could soften him through patience and prayer. Perhaps she believed that God would look kindly upon her obedience and bless the union with peace. With this quiet trust, she agreed to the marriage, even as the last delicate thread of her childhood dream slipped softly out of her hands. When the wedding day arrived, the village celebrated as tradition demanded. Friends and neighbors gathered, offering blessings and songs, unaware of the silent storm taking place inside the bride's heart. Rita, adorned in simple bridal garments, looked serene, though her eyes carried a depth of reflection that did not belong to one walking into joy. She had accepted her cross, though she did not yet know how heavy it would become. Paolo, standing beside her, held himself with a mixture of pride and restraint, as if the ceremony was merely another duty to fulfill. And so they were wed, a pairing of light and shadow, innocence and experience, quiet faith and restless spirit. Their home, though not far from her parents, felt like another world entirely. The early days of marriage stirred an uneasy quiet within Rita. She tried to create a home rooted in peace, tending to Paolo with gentle patience, preparing meals, keeping the hearth warm, praying silently for harmony. But Paolo, accustomed to the harshness of his work and the bitterness of the ongoing political strife around him, often returned home carrying the weight of his anger. At first it showed in small ways, in the sharpness of his tone, in the tension that hung in the air like a thin veil. Rita responded with calmness, meeting his moods with a quiet endurance that seemed to soften him for brief moments. Yet as time passed, the shadows within Paolo grew darker. His temper flared more easily, fueled by the feuds between rival families, the pressures of his position, and the violence that surrounded their community. What began as harsh words sometimes escalated, and the pain inflicted upon Rita became a burden she carried silently, offering each wound to God with the hope that love might still transform her husband's heart. In those years, Rita's strength deepened, not through triumph, but through suffering endured in humility. She became a woman of profound interior resilience, someone who learned to pray even when prayer felt like her only refuge from despair. She prayed for Paolo's conversion, believing that no soul was beyond the reach of grace. She prayed for peace in Cascia, for the end of feuds that had poisoned families for generations. She prayed for the courage to remain loving in a home where love often went unanswered. And she prayed for the grace to understand why God had allowed her young dreams to fade into a life so marked by hardship. Yet even in the midst of growing turbulence, small moments of tenderness appeared, almost like faint stars breaking through heavy clouds. There were days when Paolo's harshness softened, when he seemed to recognize the quiet goodness of the woman who shared his home. On those days he returned to her with gentler eyes, perhaps ashamed of his behavior, perhaps grateful for her unwavering patience. These moments gave Rita hope that transformation was possible, though she lived always on the edge of uncertainty. Outside their home, the world continued its restless agitation. Political factions clashed in Cascia and surrounding towns, drawing Paolo deeper into conflicts that fed his anger and fear. Each time he stepped out the door, Rita felt the chill of worry settle over her. She sensed that danger clung to him like a shadow, and that his involvement in the feuds would someday bring sorrow into their home. Still, she remained faithful, trusting that God could draw goodness even from the harshest circumstances. And so part 3 closes with a quiet question that settles gently into the heart. How does a soul devoted to peace survive in a life shaped by violence? And how does love endure when the cross becomes heavier each day? The answer would unfold slowly, painfully, in the years to come, revealing a holiness forged through endurance rather than ease. And so we continue from the uneasy threshold of Rita's marriage, stepping deeper now into the shadows that slowly gathered around her home. For what began as a quiet tension soon grew into a long, painful unraveling, one thread at a time, as though the peace she carried within her was the only fragile light left flickering in a house where storms no longer stayed outside. Those who knew Rita in her early years of marriage often wondered how someone so gentle could endure the sharp edges of a man like Paolo, whose temper seemed to flare with the unpredictability of lightning. Yet this is precisely where the holiness of her life began to take shape. Not in dramatic visions or sudden miracles, but in the slow, silent shaping of her soul through the daily trials she bore without bitterness. In those days, Paolo's moods hovered around the household like restless winds. Some evenings he returned quiet and brooding, pacing the floor as if searching for something he could not name. Other evenings he came through the door already ablaze with anger, his voice hard, his words slicing through the stillness Rita tried so carefully to maintain. The feuds in Cascia simmered hotter with each passing season, drawing men like Paolo deeper into paths marked by vengeance, pride, and loyalty to family alliances that had long ago forgotten the meaning of peace. Rita often waited by the small window of their home, watching for his return, her hands clasped in prayer. She never knew whether he would come back weary or enraged, or whether a rumor whispered through the streets would carry news of yet another confrontation, another heated dispute, another wound, either inflicted or received. It was a life built on uncertainty, yet she navigated it with a grace that astonished all who observed her. To understand her endurance, one must imagine her world not as a series of isolated incidents, but as a continuous struggle to cultivate peace in an environment where conflict was the native language. Her days were filled with routine tasks, preparing meals, mending garments, maintaining the household, all while absorbing the silent blows of living with a man whose anger often erupted without warning. Rita did not become hardened by suffering. Instead, something tender within her grew stronger, as though the more her circumstances pressed against her, the more determined her soul became to resist hatred, bitterness, and fear. She responded to Paolo's harshness not with defiance, but with a patience that resembled the steady flame of a candle refusing to extinguish, even when the wind howled fiercest around it. People in Roccaporena knew of Paolo's temperament, though few spoke openly of it. Some pitied Rita, others remained silent out of fear, and still others admired her quiet resilience. She never gossiped, never complained publicly, never sought sympathy. Instead, she visited the church more often, kneeling before the crucifix with a heart heavy and aching, offering God her confusion, her hurt, and her hope. In those moments she found a strange sense of clarity, that her life, though painful, had meaning in ways she could not yet understand. She placed Paolo entirely in God's hands, believing that love, offered consistently, might one day soften the hard edges inside him. Rita's parents, growing older and frailer, saw her suffering with the helpless sorrow of those who cannot intervene. They tried to offer comfort, though they understood that marriage in their time was a binding vow, not something one could simply leave behind. They prayed for her, worried for her, and admired her courage, even as they grieved the dream she relinquished for their sake, her desire to join the convent. Perhaps they wondered late at night whether they had made the right decision, whether they had unknowingly placed her on a path of sorrow. But Rita, who loved them deeply, never blamed them. She saw her marriage not as a mistake, but as a mysterious calling, a cross entrusted to her by God, even if she did not yet understand how carrying it could lead her to holiness. The world outside their home grew no gentler. Feuds between families intensified, driven by grudges older than most of the men who fought to uphold them. Many disputes erupted over seemingly small offenses, yet each carried the weight of generations. Paolo, tied by loyalty to his kin, found himself repeatedly drawn into these conflicts, sometimes willingly, sometimes reluctantly, but always with consequences that spilled into his home. The bitterness he carried into the streets followed him back into the house like a dark shadow. Rita felt this shadow as soon as he entered, sensed the tension in the air, and prayed that her words or silence, whichever God guided her to choose, would not ignite another spark. Yet despite her gentleness, she was not immune to fear. There must have been nights when she lay awake long after Paolo had fallen asleep, staring into the darkness and wondering how she could bring peace to a man consumed by turmoil. She must have wondered whether her small acts of kindness meant anything at all, whether her patience made any difference to a soul unwilling to receive it. But Rita believed in the slow work of grace. She believed that even if her efforts seemed invisible, God saw them. And so she poured herself into prayer, filling the hidden chambers of her heart with petitions for her husband's conversion. She prayed not only for Paolo, but for the men locked in the cycle of violence that surrounded him, for the families torn apart by hatred, for the children growing up in the shadows of feuds that taught them vengeance long before they learned forgiveness. The more the world hardened around her, the more she became a vessel of mercy. Despite the suffering, there were fleeting moments when Paolo's heart seemed to soften, as though touched by the warmth of the woman who refused to return his anger with anger. These were the rare evenings when he spoke with her gently, or allowed her to tend to his wounds without pushing her away, or simply sat in silence next to her, as though her presence granted him a peace he could not name. In those moments, Rita glimpsed the man he could become, the man God might still shape him into, if only grace could find enough space to enter. But such moments were fragile, like thin ice over deep waters, easily shattered by the next spark of conflict. Still, Rita held on. She believed that love, when rooted in God, was never wasted. And though her life had already become a daily offering of pain and patience, she continued forward with quiet courage, trusting that God's plan, though hidden, was unfolding even in the shadows of her home. And so we continue from the dim corridors of Rita's troubled marriage and step slowly into the world beyond her doorstep, a world whose unrest did not merely hover at the edges of their lives, but began pressing inward with increasing force, tightening around her home like a gathering storm that no prayer, however sincere, could entirely keep at bay. For Paolo Mancini was not only a man of volatile temperament, he was also deeply entangled in the turbulent political and territorial feuds that plagued the entire region of Cascia, feuds that stretched back generations and fed on ancient grievances that few living souls could even fully recount. These conflicts, simmering like embers waiting for the slightest breath to ignite them, became the harsh landscape through which Rita was forced to walk, sometimes silently, sometimes fearfully, but always with a resolve rooted not in strength, but in grace. To understand the weight of the world Paolo moved within, one must imagine the social and political tension that defined their time. Italy was not yet a unified nation, but a fragile mosaic of city-states, principalities, and shifting alliances. Cascia, perched among the rugged mountains of Umbria, had become a microcosm of larger conflicts. Families aligned themselves with different factions, some loyal to local rulers, others tied to faraway powers, all bound by threads of loyalty, pride, and unresolved wounds from earlier generations. Honor demanded loyalty, loyalty demanded retaliation, retaliation demanded blood, and blood, once spilled, reawakened every old memory of injustice, forcing the cycle to begin again. Men like Paolo were raised within this culture, almost without choice. To be a soldier was to defend one's allies and avenge one's losses, and to refuse this obligation was to risk dishonor, suspicion, or even death. And so, even as Rita tried desperately to create a sanctuary of peace inside her home, the world outside offered Paolo nothing but agitation. It hardened him, sharpening his temper until it seemed that each argument in the town square, Each rumor of rivalry, each whispered threat, lodged itself deeper inside him. Rita saw the change in him long before others did. She saw how his shoulders tightened when he returned home, how his voice carried the tension of barely contained rage, how he paced before speaking, as though trying to rein in something fierce and restless inside him. She watched him, not with judgment, but with the heart of a woman who loved beyond reason. A woman who believed that if she prayed enough, suffered enough, forgave enough, God might use her smallness to soften the turmoil consuming her husband. But the feuds in Cascia did not relent. They swirled around Paolo like a force determined to pull him deeper into darkness. The quarrels between rival families grew sharper, fed by the smallest incidents. A perceived slight at market, an argument over land boundaries, a misunderstood gesture that blossomed into insult. Families aligned themselves into two major factions, each seeking dominance, each claiming righteousness. Paolo, driven more by loyalty and pride than by personal hatred, aligned with one of these groups, an alliance that bound him to a cycle of violence he could neither escape nor control. Some nights, when Rita waited for him long past sundown, she stood by the window listening for the echo of footsteps on the narrow stone path leading to their home. Her prayers during those moments were a whispered plea. Lord, protect him, keep him safe, bring him home. And when he finally did return, his arrival sometimes filled her with relief, sometimes with dread, depending on the look in his eyes, or the smell of blood on his clothing. There were days when Paolo left their home with a fury that frightened her. She could sense when something within him had reached a breaking point, when the anger simmering in the town spilled into his heart and made him restless, reckless, unpredictable. He would speak harshly of rival families, of betrayals he felt personally even when they had little to do with him, of injustices that demanded retribution. And though Rita listened with her customary patience, she knew she was witnessing her husband's slow transformation into someone shaped less by his own nature than by the world pressuring him from every side. Her efforts to bring peace often felt like placing a single candle before a raging wind, only to watch it flicker wildly. Yet she lit it anew, again and again, because she believed that even the smallest light mattered. Neighbors saw this struggle and admired her quiet perseverance. Some encouraged her, saying she was a blessing to her husband. Others, more cynical, warned her to brace for worse days. Still others whispered that Paolo's involvement in the feuds would surely end in tragedy, because those who lived by violence eventually reaped its bitter harvest. Rita listened to these whispers not to feed fear, but to know how she might pray more deeply, more urgently, more truthfully. She often walked alone to the little church, pressing her forehead against the cool stone of its walls, asking God to intervene in her husband's soul, to break the chains of hatred wrapped around him. At home, she tried to offer Paolo warmth and normalcy, simple meals, a clean home, gentle conversation, silence when silence soothed him, and forgiveness when forgiveness was needed. She often wondered whether peace was something fragile or something strong. Was it a delicate flower that wilted under the weight of conflict, or was it a root hidden deep in the soil, impossible to uproot even in the fiercest storm? She clung to hope that peace, once planted, could survive anything, even a household overshadowed by anger and a city shaped by bloodshed. And though Paolo did not always acknowledge it, he sometimes softened because of her unwavering steadiness. He found in her presence a kind of solace, an anchor that steadied him when grief or rage threatened to swallow him. But these moments were fleeting. The world beyond their walls was too loud, too demanding, too filled with obligations to violence. Paolo could not simply step away from the feuds. They clung to him like armor he could not remove. And so the slow unraveling of their home continued. Each incident in the streets brought new tension into their marriage. Each rumor of conflict tightened the invisible threads binding Paolo to his faction. Each warning from neighbors reminded Rita that she lived not merely with a troubled husband, but with a man standing dangerously close to the edge of violent fate. And so we continue from the widening circles of conflict that had begun to swallow Paolo's life, moving now into the tender and difficult chapter where Rita's heart became divided between the man she tried so tirelessly to redeem and the two young sons who looked to her for guidance, yet slowly drifted toward a darkness they barely understood. It is here, in this fragile space between motherhood and sorrow, that the quiet desperation of a mother's love emerges with extraordinary clarity. For although Rita had carried her marriage as a cross for many years, the weight of that suffering multiplied once she realized that the anger shaping her husband was beginning to shape their sons as well. Their names are often recorded simply as two sons, but tradition holds that they were young, spirited, and impressionable boys, born into a home where tension lived like a third parent, shaping the rhythm of their days. Rita loved them with a tenderness that seemed almost to overflow from her. Each gesture, each smile, each whispered prayer showing the depth of a mother's devotion. In the early years, before they were old enough to understand the world around them, she believed she could shield them from the atmosphere Paolo brought into their home. She told them stories of kindness, of saints who chose peace over anger, of the love of Christ that could heal any wound. She taught them to pray, guiding their small hands as they made the sign of the cross, hoping to plant seeds of gentleness deep within them. But children, especially sons who idolize their fathers, naturally absorb what they see more than what they are taught. And Paolo, whose life had become a revolving door of conflict, wore his resentment and frustration like a garment his sons could not help but notice. When he raised his voice at home, they watched. When he spoke bitterly about his enemies, they listened. And when he returned with stories of feuds and battles, their young imaginations absorbed these tales with a dangerous mixture of fascination and pride. Rita felt this shift like a chill that enters a room unnoticed but settles deep into the bones. She noticed how their questions changed, how they wanted to know who had offended their father, who was to blame, whether vengeance was justified. They began to echo words they heard from Paolo and the men around him, words heavy with anger and threat. Sometimes they played at fighting in the courtyard, imitating gestures they had seen among soldiers, their faces animated in ways that frightened Rita. At first she smiled gently and tried to redirect them, but gradually her smile faded, replaced by a quiet fear she could not easily express. She began to pray not just for her husband, but for her sons, often rising before dawn to kneel beside their sleeping forms, tracing the sign of the cross gently over their foreheads. She prayed that God would protect their innocence, that he would soften their hearts, that he would guard them from the poison of hatred seeping into their lives from every direction. But the feuds in Cascia were relentless, tightening around every family involved, and Rita's home was not spared. Her sons grew older, no longer sheltered by childhood's simplicity. They overheard conversations Paolo had with his allies. They saw the tension in the home escalate whenever a new conflict arose. They saw the fire in their father's eyes when he spoke of honor and revenge. And slowly, despite Rita's best efforts, they began to mirror him. The boys admired Paolo, not the gentle moments he rarely displayed, but the strength, the defiance, the reputation he held. In a world where men were measured by their involvement in conflict, they wanted to be seen as worthy of their father's name. Rita could feel them slipping through her fingers like sand. Their tempers grew shorter, their voices sharper, and they began to challenge one another with the kind of competitiveness that hinted at future danger. When they argued, their words carried the tones of Paolo's anger, echoing through the house with painful familiarity. Rita tried to intervene gently. She spoke to them about forgiveness, about the dignity of choosing peace, about Christ's commandment to love even one's enemies. But they were young, and in their youth they believed strength was loud and mercy was weak. They listened politely, but not deeply. Their hearts, already tugged by the world around them, did not know how to reconcile their mother's teachings with the example of their father. This realization weighed heavily on Rita, creating a sorrow that felt different from the suffering she had endured in her marriage. For a woman can carry the burden of her husband's flaws with resignation, but the thought of those flaws shaping her children was a grief she had never imagined. She felt as though she were standing at a crossroads, watching her sons walk toward a path she feared would lead them into harm, and she did not know how to call them back. There were days when she tried to bring more warmth into their home, hoping that simple gestures, a favorite meal, a quiet story before bed, a moment of prayer, might anchor her sons to a gentler way of living. And sometimes it seemed to work. Sometimes they softened, leaning into her embrace, listening with wide-eyed wonder as she spoke of the saints or of God's mercy. But the outside world always called them back. The men in the streets, the whispers of feuds, the expectations placed upon boys growing into young men, all these forces tugged at them constantly, leaving Rita fighting a battle she feared she might lose. She watched them grow taller, stronger, more confident, yet also more restless. Their eyes no longer held the innocent curiosity of childhood, but a flicker of something sharper. They began asking Paolo more questions about his work, about his loyalties, about the enemies he despised. And Paolo, proud to see his sons showing interest in the matters that occupied his life, answered them freely, unaware of the danger he was nurturing. Rita tried to speak with Paolo about her concerns, approaching him when his temper seemed most at ease. But he dismissed her worries, assuring her that boys needed strength, that they needed to learn how to defend their family's honor, that the world was too dangerous for softness. Softness, he said, was for women. But Rita, who had come to understand suffering as a teacher rather than a threat, knew that softness was not weakness. It was strength born of faith, strength that Paolo did not yet recognize because he had never allowed it to shape him. And so we continue from the quiet ache of a mother, watching her sons drift toward a world that had already consumed their father, stepping now into the darkest turn of Rita's life, the moment when violence, long circling the edges of her home like a wolf waiting its time, finally sank its teeth into the heart of her family. For as the feuds in Cascia intensified and the hatreds between rival factions hardened into inevitability, the fragile boundary between Rita's attempts at peace and the inevitable force of bloodshed collapsed, ushering in a tragedy that would reshape every part of her journey. For years, she had watched Paolo walk in and out of their home, carrying the dust and fire of conflict on his shoulders, and she had feared, deeply, silently, that one day he would not return. But when that day arrived, it came not as an abrupt shock, but as something that felt dreadfully familiar, as though she had been preparing her heart for this sorrow long before she dared to name it. The event itself, when it happened, slipped into Rita's life not with warning, but with whispers. It was an afternoon like any other, the kind where the sun poured gently over the rooftops of Roccaporena, and the air held a deceptive stillness. Rita had been working in the home, perhaps preparing a meal or mending clothing, when she heard the murmurs, voices rising outside, hushed but urgent. She stepped to the door and saw neighbors huddled in tight clusters, their expressions carved with pity and dread. As soon as their eyes met hers, she knew. The world seemed to contract into a single, breathless moment as they approached her with the news. Paolo had been murdered. The words fell softly, almost apologetically, as though spoken too loudly they might shatter her entirely. He had been ambushed, struck down by rivals in a retaliation that had little to do with him personally, and everything to do with the unending chain of vengeance that defined their town. A life taken because another had been taken before it. A wound inflicted because another wound had demanded repayment. A predictable act in a world where predictability was part of the tragedy. Rita felt the ground beneath her shift, not with shock, because she had feared this outcome for so long, but with an overwhelming mixture of grief, sorrow, and an ache too deep for words. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She simply bowed her head, as though accepting a cross that had always been waiting for her shoulders. In the hours that followed, neighbors helped carry Paolo's lifeless body home. It is said that Rita did not turn away from him, did not resent him, did not curse the men who had taken his life. Instead, she knelt beside him with a quiet dignity, as though grief had sanctified the space around them. She touched his cold forehead and whispered a prayer of forgiveness, not because she dismissed the pain he had caused her, but because she understood, more deeply than anyone, that a heart consumed by hatred finds no rest in this life or the next. Her sons, however, did not share her disposition. When they saw their father's body, broken, bloodied, the consequence of feuds they had been raised to regard with pride, a fire ignited within them. They stood at his side, not in sorrow alone, but in a fierce, rising anger. Their young faces, once so tender in childhood, hardened with the certainty that honor demanded retribution. In their world, a father's death was not merely a personal loss, but a call to arms, a summons to avenge the family name. Rita saw it immediately, the tightening of their jaws, the darkening in their eyes, and her heart clenched in fear. Paolo's death was a tragedy, but what terrified her more was the possibility that her sons would now be drawn even deeper into the violent legacy that had claimed their father. She understood better than anyone that revenge was a poison that disguised itself as duty, and once swallowed, it consumed everything in its path. She knew that if her sons pursued vengeance, they would either kill or be killed. Either path would destroy them. And so, even as she grieved her husband, Rita began the most agonizing battle of her life, the struggle to save her sons from following him into the darkness. In the days that followed, mourners filled her home, offering condolences and sharing memories of Paolo, some noble, some troubled, all wrapped in the complicated tapestry of a man shaped by violence. Customs demanded that the family speak of justice, of retaliation, of the next steps in the cycle of revenge. Rita listened politely, but offered no encouragement. Instead, she repeated softly, almost urgently, words of forgiveness, of mercy, of surrendering anger to God. Her insistence unsettled some. How could she speak of forgiveness when her husband had been murdered? How could she refuse to demand justice when honor required it? But Rita was not deterred by their bewilderment. She understood that the justice of men often masked a deeper injustice, one that devoured not only its victims, but those who wielded it. Her sons, however, resisted her pleas. They were old enough to feel the sting of humiliation, young enough to believe that vengeance could restore their father's dignity, and vulnerable enough to be influenced by the men around them who encouraged retaliation. Each day, Rita spoke to them with increasing urgency, her voice filled with a mother's trembling love. "My children, do not seek revenge. Do not follow this path. Do not let hatred claim your souls." But they would turn away, angry, confused, convinced that their mother's gentleness was weakness. They saw only the grave that had taken their father, not the grave that awaited them if they continued on this path. Rita's desperation grew. She prayed through the night, knelt before the crucifix, fasted, wept, begged God to intervene. Her prayers were not vague, they were painfully specific. She begged God to prevent her sons from committing murder, begged him to stop them at any cost. At times she felt torn in two. She did not want to lose her children, yet she feared even more deeply the thought of them losing their souls. She understood what few could fathom, that sometimes the greatest act of mercy God can grant is the one that prevents evil, even when it comes through sorrow. And so we continue from the harrowing moment when Rita realized that the true danger no longer lay in the feuds raging outside her home, but in the vengeance taking root within the hearts of her sons, stepping now into one of the most agonizing chapters of her life, a chapter in which a mother, caught between her love for her children and her faith in the mercy of God, faced a choice so painful that no human heart could bear it without divine strength. For Paolo's murder had not only ended his life, it had awakened a thirst for retribution in his sons, a thirst that threatened to carry them into the same darkness that had claimed their father and so many men before him. From the moment they stood beside Paolo's lifeless body, the boys had been seized by a fierce, unrelenting conviction that their father's honor must be avenged. They believed, with the intensity of youth fed by the culture around them, that justice required blood, specifically the blood of the men who had taken their father's life, and in a community where revenge was seen not merely as expected, but as noble, no one around them attempted to turn them from this path. On the contrary, some encouraged it, whispering in their ears, reminding them of their father's courage, fueling the flame already burning within them. Rita watched all this with increasing despair. She saw her boys' grief twisting into rage, their sorrow calcifying into plans for retaliation. They whispered in corners, exchanged determined glances, and slipped out of the house more frequently, returning with a secrecy that unsettled her. She recognized these signs because she had seen them in Paolo many times before. The restless pacing, the tightening of fists, the growing silence that preceded violent action. It was as though she were witnessing her husband's spirit echoing through her sons, pulling them toward a fate she dreaded with every breath. Each night, after they had gone to bed, Rita knelt beside them and prayed with a desperation she had never known. She prayed for their hearts, prayed for their safety, prayed that God would shatter the chain of vengeance wrapped around their lives. Her prayers became more fervent, her fasting more severe. She offered God everything, her peace, her strength, her tears, if only he would prevent her sons from walking the path of their father. Yet as the days passed, she saw no change. Their anger deepened, their resolve hardened. Their innocence, already frayed by years of observing conflict, began to wither entirely. And so the terrible question grew louder in her heart. What if her sons were already too far gone? What if nothing she said could reach them? What if they were destined either to kill or be killed? The thought of losing them was unbearable. But the thought of them committing murder was far more horrifying. Rita understood that a violent act would not restore their father's dignity. It would only stain their own souls with a weight they would carry forever. It would bind them to the very darkness that had destroyed Paolo. And so, in one of the most paradoxical acts of love ever recorded in the lives of the saints, Rita turned her prayers toward a plea she could scarcely utter aloud. Kneeling before the crucifix one night, her face wet with tears, she whispered words that seemed impossible for any mother to say. Lord, take them rather than let them commit a mortal sin. Do not allow them to become murderers. Do whatever you must to save their souls. This prayer did not come from despair or coldness. It came from a profound and terrible love, a love willing to lose everything if it meant saving her children's eternal lives. She did not seek their death, she sought their salvation, but she surrendered them entirely into God's hands, trusting that His mercy, however it unfolded, would be greater than her fear. And the answer came far sooner than she expected. Shortly after Paolo's death, both boys fell gravely ill. At first it seemed like a passing fever, one of those sudden illnesses that often swept through the region. Rita tended to them tirelessly, pressing cool cloths to their foreheads, offering them broth, praying at their bedside. But the fever only worsened, their strength faded, their once fiery eyes grew dull with exhaustion. And in the quiet moments when she sat beside them, she felt a dawning realization that cut through her heart like a blade. God had heard her prayer. She did not rejoice. She did not despair. She simply held their hands and whispered words of love, not letting them know the turmoil inside her. The boys, weakened by illness and softened by suffering, became more open to her presence than they had been in months. For the first time since Paolo's death, she saw traces of the gentleness they had known in childhood, glimpses of innocence not yet fully extinguished. As their illness deepened, Rita recognized that she had been granted a window of grace, a precious, fleeting chance to guide their souls toward forgiveness. Sitting beside them, she spoke not of vengeance but of God's mercy. She reminded them that their father, wounded by anger in life, would not want his sons to lose their souls in death. She told them that nothing they could do would bring him back, and that hatred would only chain them to sorrow. She spoke softly, her voice trembling with both love and fear, urging them to forgive, to release their anger, to entrust their father to God. And slowly, the hardness in their expressions melted. The fever had weakened their bodies, but suffering had softened their hearts. In the final days of their illness, the boys surrendered their anger, allowing Rita to pray with them, to speak of heaven, to assure them that God would receive them with tenderness. Their deaths came quietly, not in a moment of dramatic crisis, but as a gentle passing, like candles slowly burning down to their wicks. Rita held each of them as they left this world, her tears falling silently onto their faces. She did not cry out. She did not accuse God. She simply wept with the raw, aching sorrow of a mother who had given everything and lost everything, and yet trusted that in this loss, God had saved her children's souls. When the second son breathed his last, the house fell into a silence so deep it felt as though time itself had stopped. Rita, now utterly alone, knelt between the two still bodies of her sons and whispered a prayer of surrender. She had feared losing them, and now that fear had become reality. Yet in her heart, she understood that God's mercy had prevailed. Not in the way she had hoped, but in the way He knew was necessary. And so we continue from the heart-rending moment when Rita found herself standing at the threshold of a home, emptied of every voice she had ever loved, stepping now into the long, desolate season of her life, when silence became both her companion and her teacher. For after the deaths of her sons, the house that had once echoed with Paolo's footsteps and the laughter, quarrels, and restless movements of her children now felt like a hollow shell, a place where even the breeze seemed to tiptoe with reverence for the depths of her sorrow. Yet it was within this stillness, this vast, aching quiet, that the seeds of her future sanctity began to take root, not through triumph, but through a surrender so complete that it reshaped her soul. Rita had always known suffering. She had endured Paolo's temper, the fear of feuds, the anxiety of watching her sons drift toward violence. But nothing had prepared her for the absolute emptiness that followed their deaths. Grief can take many forms: rage, numbness, despair. But for Rita, it manifested as a heavy stillness, as though life itself had paused, waiting to see whether she would collapse under the weight of her losses or rise slowly from them, step by trembling step. Her neighbors mourned with her, yet they also stepped back, allowing her space to carry her sorrow in the way she instinctively did, quietly, prayerfully, with a dignity that surprised even those who had admired her before. Many wondered how she could endure such devastation without bitterness, without questioning God, without shutting herself off from the world entirely. But Rita, whose faith had been forged in the crucible of suffering, understood something many overlooked: that grief does not erase God's presence, even when it obscures it. In the silence of her empty home, she continued to pray, sometimes with words, sometimes with tears that needed no explanation. She would rise before dawn, as she always had, kneel before the crucifix, and offer God the only thing she had left, her heart, shattered but still beating. She prayed for her sons' souls, trusting they were now safe in heaven. She prayed for Paolo, praying he might find peace in God's mercy. She prayed for the men who had killed him, for those who had fueled the feuds that consumed her family, for those still trapped in cycles of hatred. And she prayed for herself, not for comfort, but for clarity. Clarity to understand what God asked of her now that every earthly tie had been cut. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Slowly, a new desire rose within her, faint at first, like a small flame flickering in ashes, then growing steadier with time. She felt once more called to a religious life. The dream she had laid aside in obedience to her parents now resurfaced with greater urgency. She yearned not just for peace, but for a life wholly dedicated to God, free from the turbulence that had marked her years as a wife and mother. The convent of the Augustinian sisters in Cascia had drawn her heart since childhood. And now, with no one left to care for, she felt her steps guided once more toward its stone walls. Yet when she approached the convent for the first time after her sons' deaths, she was turned away. The nuns, though compassionate, adhered to a strict rule. They did not admit widows who had been associated with feuding families. They feared that bringing Rita into their community might bring the violence of the outside world within their cloistered walls. They respected her grief, but could not risk the fragile peace of their order. Rita accepted their decision with humility, though her heart ached. She knew the obstacle was not personal, but tied to the legacy of blood that clung to her husband's name and, by extension, to her. Still, she did not give up. She returned again, gently asking for admittance. Again she was refused. A third time she came, her voice soft, her posture reverent, and once more the doors remained closed. Many women would have accepted this as a final judgment, but Rita had learned through suffering that God's will often unfolds slowly, requiring patience, perseverance, and a trust deeper than disappointment. In the solitude of her home, she prayed fervently for God to open a path for her. She understood that reconciliation was needed before she could hope to enter the convent. Not only reconciliation between herself and the nuns, but between the feuding families whose hatred had shaped her entire life. She understood, perhaps more deeply than anyone, that God was calling her not merely to join the convent, but to become an instrument of peace in a fractured world. And so, though she had no husband, no children, no earthly ties left, she carried within her a mission that came directly from the heart of Christ: to bring peace where vengeance had reigned. One night, after praying intensely for guidance, Rita experienced something extraordinary, a vision in which she saw 3 saints standing beside her: St. Augustine, St. Nicholas of Tolentino, and St. John the Baptist. These holy figures appeared to her not as distant, unreachable lights, but as guides offering a path forward. They beckoned her gently, leading her not to her home or to the convent, but toward a place where old resentments could be laid to rest, the home of the men with whom her husband's family had feuded for years. When she awoke, she understood what God was asking of her. Before she could enter the convent, she had to reconcile her husband's family with those who had spilled his blood. This task was not merely difficult, it was unimaginable. The hatred between these families ran deep, carved through generations, fueled by memories of injustice, betrayal, and violence. Yet Rita, strengthened by grace, set out to do what no one else dared. She approached the members of her husband's family first, speaking not of revenge but of forgiveness. She reminded them that Paolo was gone, that her sons were gone, that the feuds had already taken everything from her, and she urged them to let go of bitterness before it consumed them entirely. Her humility and grief softened their hearts, and to her astonishment, they agreed to consider peace. Next, she approached the rival family, the one that had murdered Paolo. She came not as an accuser, but as a widow whose faith had taught her to love even those who had hurt her. She spoke gently of forgiveness, of ending the cycles of suffering, and of the possibility of restoring peace. Her words, spoken without anger and carrying the weight of her suffering, disarmed even the hardest among them. Through her persistence, her compassion, and her unwavering trust in God, she achieved what had once seemed impossible: reconciliation between 2 families long locked in hatred. When this reconciliation was complete, Rita returned once more to the convent. This time the nuns, witnessing the miracle she had accomplished, saw that her calling was unmistakably from God. They opened their doors to her, welcoming her not as a widow of a feud, but as a woman transformed by grace. And so we continue from the quiet, courageous act of reconciliation that had finally softened the hardened hearts of feuding families, stepping now into the moment when the doors that had long remained closed to Rita at last opened, not through her persistence alone, nor through the sympathy of others, but through an unmistakable sign of God's intervention, a miracle woven so gently into her story that it became one of its most treasured moments. For Rita, after burying her husband, after surrendering her sons, after healing the wounds of ancient hatred, stood now at the threshold of the Augustinian convent in Cascia, her heart stripped of everything but her longing for God. She had surrendered the world, and in doing so she found that heaven was finally ready to receive her. Yet even though the families were reconciled, even though the violence surrounding her life had quieted, the nuns at the convent were still hesitant. They admired Rita deeply. No one could deny her holiness, her humility, her sorrow carried with grace, but they also knew that religious life was not granted because of suffering alone. It was a path for those called unmistakably by God, and they needed certainty that admitting her would not disturb the order or its contemplative silence. They needed assurance that she was genuinely chosen for this life, that her presence among them would be God's will and not merely human hope. And so, though they no longer opposed her entry from fear or resentment, they waited. They prayed. They asked God to make His will known. What happened next became one of the most beloved miracles associated with Saint Rita's life. According to tradition, the three saints who had appeared to her before, Saint Augustine, Saint Nicholas of Tolentino, and Saint John the Baptist, returned one night as she prayed in her home. They stood beside her as she slept, radiant yet gentle, and beckoned her once more. Then, in a moment that defied every earthly explanation, they carried her, either spiritually or physically, within the walls of the convent at Cascia. Some say she awoke inside the sanctuary, the heavy doors locked from within, the sisters discovering her there at dawn in prayer. Others say the saints guided her in a vision so real that she arrived at the convent without ever touching the ground outside. However one interprets it, the meaning was clear. God Himself had opened the gates that no human hand had been able to open. The nuns, filled with awe, accepted this sign with humble reverence. They saw in Rita not just a widow seeking refuge, but a soul chosen for their community. And so, after years of longing, of rejection, of grief and perseverance, Rita was finally welcomed into the Augustinian convent, beginning the sacred life she had desired since girlhood. Entering religious life at a later age than most novices, Rita brought with her not the innocence of a sheltered young woman, but the depth of one who had lived, suffered, forgiven, and been transformed. Her new life did not erase her past. It sanctified it. She did not step into the convent as someone trying to escape the world, but as someone who had already walked through its valleys and discovered God waiting there. The sisters quickly noticed the qualities that made her unlike anyone they had known. Rita was humble in a way that felt luminous, as though her humility came not from self-doubt, but from a clear understanding that everything she had endured belonged now to God. She embraced every task with eagerness, whether cleaning floors, tending to the sick, or participating in long hours of prayer. She did not seek special roles or recognition. She did not dwell on her past, nor did she expect sympathy for her losses. She simply lived each day with a quiet, fervent devotion that seemed to deepen with every breath. In the convent, she found a rhythm her soul had long desired. The bells that marked the hours of prayer became the gentle heartbeat of her days. The chants rising in the chapel felt like balm on wounds still tender from grief. The silence, far from being empty, seemed full of God's presence, a presence she had sought first in childhood, then in marriage, then in the ruins of heartbreak. Now, at last, she could give herself wholly to Him. Yet even within the convent's peaceful walls, the memory of the violence she had witnessed did not fade. Instead, it transformed into compassion, compassion for all who suffered, for all who sinned, for all who were trapped in the cycles of hatred that had scarred her early life. Rita began offering her prayers not only for the community, but for the world beyond it, for sinners, for families torn apart by conflict, for those unable to forgive. She became, within the quiet of cloistered life, a vessel of intercession. Her sisters observed that whenever a conflict arose within the community, small misunderstandings, tensions, wounds that inevitably emerge among even the holiest of people, it was Rita who mediated with gentleness. She spoke rarely and listened deeply. She encouraged reconciliation in ways that felt almost supernatural in their effectiveness. Her presence brought a peace that softened even the most resistant hearts. It was not long before the convent recognized that Rita's vocation was not just to prayer, but to healing, to bridging divides, to bringing harmony where discord threatened to grow. But her path within the convent would not be free of suffering. Holiness, for Rita, was always tied to the cross. And it was within these walls, where she had finally found peace, that she would soon encounter a deeper, more mysterious participation in Christ's passion. For the time was approaching when the quiet flame of devotion in her heart would draw her into union with the suffering Christ in a way no one could have foreseen. Yet before those extraordinary events, Part 10 rests on the gentle truth revealed through this chapter of her life. That God, who had seemed to strip her of everything, was, in fact, preparing her for a life of profound intimacy with Him. In the convent, Rita did not escape her sorrow. She offered it. She did not forget her past. She consecrated it. And the doors that had once closed against her now stood not merely open, but transformed into a passage toward the deepest mystery of grace. So this section closes with a soft question, lingering like incense in the chapel. How does a heart that has known so much suffering become ready to receive a thorn from the very crown of Christ? The answer, still veiled in gentle mystery, would unfold in the next part of her holy journey. And so we continue from the quiet miracle of Rita's entrance into the convent, stepping now into the period of her life when her soul, already shaped by grief and surrender, began to open itself to a deeper and more mysterious union with Christ's passion. The convent had become a sanctuary for her, a place where the wounds of her past, though not forgotten, found rest in the silence of prayer and the rhythm of daily devotion. But holiness, especially the kind born through suffering, rarely remains still. It deepens, it expands, it pulls the soul toward a love so profound that it can only be understood through the cross. And it was within those stone walls, in the quiet corridors of the Augustinian community, that Rita began to walk a path marked by a suffering unlike any she had known before, suffering not inflicted by the world, but given by God as a mysterious gift. Rita's days in the convent were marked by humility. She had no desire to stand out, no wish for recognition. She carried out her duties with a reverence that made even the most mundane tasks shimmer with quiet holiness. She swept floors as though preparing a path for Christ. She tended the sick as though dressing the wounds of the crucified Jesus. She prayed not for herself but for the world, especially for those she knew were burdened by hatred, conflict, and unforgiveness. The sisters often noticed the depth of her devotion. During communal prayer, her face would take on a serenity that seemed almost luminous, as though she were caught in a conversation with someone they could not hear. She often lingered before the crucifix, long after the others had left, her eyes fixed upon Christ's wounded body with a tenderness shaped by her own life's sorrows. It was during one of these moments of prayer, while meditating on the passion of Christ, that the event occurred which would mark her forever. The sisters had gathered to reflect on the suffering of Jesus, contemplating the agony he endured for humanity. As Rita knelt before the crucifix, her heart filled with longing to be united to the love revealed in his wounds. She was not seeking suffering for its own sake. She had already known more suffering than most lives could contain. But she desired to share in Christ's sorrow in a way that would deepen her union with him. And so, with words spoken only in the silence of her heart, she offered herself completely. Lord, allow me to share in your suffering, if it is your will. Let me feel something of the thorns that pierced your sacred head, not because I am worthy, but because I love you. At that moment, something extraordinary happened. As she looked upon the crucifix, one of the thorns from the crown on Christ's head is said to have loosened, and, in a mysterious movement defying earthly explanation, flown toward her, striking her forehead. Immediately, a small wound opened, deep, painful, and bleeding. The sisters, startled by her sudden cry, rushed to her side and found her trembling, the mark already forming. They understood quickly that this was not an injury caused by human hands. It was a mystical wound, a sign that God had accepted her offering, allowing her to participate in the suffering of Christ in a way few souls ever experience. The wound did not close. It became a permanent mark on Rita's body, a physical reminder of her union with Christ's passion. But this wound was not merely visible. It was deeply painful. It throbbed continuously, as though the thorn were still embedded within her. It bled at times, it irritated her skin, and it emitted a strong and unpleasant odor, one that caused discomfort to those around her. This was perhaps the most humiliating part of her mystical suffering. For holiness, in the eyes of the world, is often imagined as something beautiful, noble, adorned with light. But in reality, the deepest holiness often carries a harsh, hidden cost. And Rita bore that cost with humility so profound it softened even the hearts of those who struggled to understand her. Because of the odor from her wound, the sisters sometimes asked her to withdraw from communal gatherings. During certain liturgical events, especially when guests visited the convent, Rita had to remain in the background or in her cell, offering her prayers from afar. Rather than take offense, she accepted this exclusion with grace. She saw it as another form of participation in Christ's suffering, his rejection, his solitude, his misunderstood love. Her cell became her sanctuary, a place where she could pray without distraction, where she could offer her pain for the world, where she could speak to God in the quiet language of the heart. Her sisters, though occasionally troubled by the odor of the wound, grew to revere her more deeply. They saw her patience, her humility, her refusal to complain even when the pain was severe. They noticed how she continued to serve the community when she was able, moving slowly but with deliberate kindness, her eyes always bright with a gentle compassion. They began to understand that the thorn was not a punishment or a curse, but a mysterious grace, a sign that Christ had chosen her to share in his passion for the sake of others. Word of the wound spread slowly beyond the convent walls. Some came seeking miracles, believing that a woman marked by Christ might intercede for their needs. Others came simply to witness the holiness they had heard whispered about. Rita received each visitor with the same humility she offered her sisters, never drawing attention to herself, always pointing others toward God. She did not want admiration. She desired only to love and serve. As the years passed, the wound remained with her, an unceasing companion. It weakened her body but strengthened her soul. It taught her that suffering, when united to Christ, becomes a channel of grace, not only for oneself, but for the entire world. The odor, though unpleasant, became a symbol of the hidden cost of holiness. For the path to God is often marked not by visible splendor, but by sacrifices seen only by heaven. And so we continue from the moment when Rita received the thorn upon her forehead, stepping gently now into the long, solemn desert of suffering that defined the final years of her life within the convent. A season in which pain and grace intertwined so intimately that it became impossible to separate one from the other. For though the wound she bore was small in appearance, its effects reached into every corner of her existence, drawing her into a profound and hidden union with Christ's passion. Her days became quieter, slower, marked by increasing frailty, yet her spirit grew only more luminous, as though the thorn had opened not just her skin but the very depths of her soul, allowing divine light to seep into places human suffering alone could never reach. In the early months after receiving the wound, Rita still participated in many of the convent's tasks. though she moved with more caution, her steps careful, her expression steady even as pain radiated from her forehead. But gradually, as the wound deepened and her body weakened, she spent more time in her small cell. It was a plain room. Stone walls, a narrow window, a simple wooden bed. And yet within its silence, she found a richness that the world beyond could never offer. Here she spoke to God as one speaks to a trusted friend, sharing her fears, her longings, her gratitude, her intercessions. The pain was constant, sometimes sharp, sometimes throbbing, but it drew her inward, into a place of prayer so profound that even her sisters marveled at the peace that radiated from her despite her suffering. The thorn wound, however, came with a harsh and humiliating reality. Its odor, pungent and unrelenting, filled the air around her, making it difficult for others to remain in close proximity. Though her sisters loved her deeply, they could not ignore the discomfort it caused during shared spaces. At times, they gently asked her to pray in her cell instead of the chapel, particularly when visitors were present or during solemn liturgical celebrations. And yet, Rita accepted this isolation without complaint. She did not wish to burden anyone. Instead, she saw in this exclusion another way of following the humility of Christ, who himself was often misunderstood, avoided, or pushed aside. Her willingness to withdraw was not a resignation, but an offering, an act of love for her community, demonstrating that holiness is never about drawing attention, but about giving oneself quietly for others. As time passed, Rita's suffering became more inward. The thorn wound remained open, never healing, never easing, its pain woven into her daily existence. But now illness began to claim her as well. Her strength faltered. She walked with growing difficulty. Eventually, she became confined almost entirely to her bed. The sisters visited her often, bringing water, offering prayers, sitting beside her when the pain became unbearable. They found her always serene, her face often lifted slightly, as though listening to a voice beyond the room. She spoke little about her suffering, but when she did, it was never with complaint. Instead, she spoke of Christ, of his wounds, of his love for the world, of her desire to offer every moment, every breath, every ache for the salvation of souls. In these long months of illness, Rita's cell became a place of quiet miracles. The sisters noticed that whenever they entered to tend to her, a strange peace settled over them, as though the air itself held a softness that eased their worries. They began to ask her for prayers, not because she was free from suffering, but because she carried it with such grace. They believed God listened to her in a special way, and many found comfort simply in being near her. It was during one particularly harsh winter, when the cold seeped into the convent walls and illness spread through the region, that something extraordinary occurred. Rita, who had scarcely moved from her bed in months, asked one of the sisters to go to her family's garden in Roccaporena and bring her a rose. The sister, startled by the request, gently reminded her that it was the dead of winter, mid-January, and nothing grew in the frozen ground. Roses would not return until spring. But Rita simply smiled, her voice faint yet certain. "Go. You will find one." Touched by her faith, the sister made the difficult journey down to Roccaporena, expecting nothing yet driven by hope. When she reached the old garden, covered with frost and bare branches, she paused, searching the stillness. To her astonishment, there it was, a single rose blooming in the snow, fresh, fragrant, impossible by every natural measure. She fell to her knees, overwhelmed, understanding that this was not a flower, but a message, a sign of God's tenderness toward his suffering servant. She returned to the convent carrying the rose, its petals like a quiet miracle cupped in her hands. When she placed it in Rita's frail fingers, the dying saint closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for the gift itself, but for the love behind it. In time, Rita again asked for another sign, a fig from the same garden. Once more, though it was the wrong season, the fig was found waiting, ripe and sweet. These miracles became symbols of Rita's sanctity, reminders that the God she loved so deeply had not forgotten her, even as her earthly strength faded. Through all of this, Rita remained profoundly united to Christ. She told her sisters that suffering was not a punishment, but an invitation to rest closer to the heart of Jesus, to feel the weight of his love for the world. She believed that by offering her own pain, she could intercede for sinners, for the suffering, for the wounded, for the broken. Her prayers grew more intense, more expansive, wrapped around the world beyond the convent walls. Even in her final years, she prayed for peace in the region, for reconciliation among families, for healing from the violence that had shaped her early life. She prayed for those who had harmed her, and for those she had lost. Nothing was excluded from her intercession. Everything was brought to God, and so we continue from the long winter of Rita's suffering, moving gently now toward the final chapter of her earthly life, a chapter marked not by a sudden release from pain, but by a deepening serenity, as though her soul, having traveled through every valley of sorrow, was now preparing for the quiet ascent into eternal light. The thorn wound, the illness that had slowly taken hold of her frail body, the years of solitude within her little cell, all these had become so interwoven with her identity that suffering itself no longer felt like an intrusion, but like an intimate companion, guiding her toward the one she had loved so completely. Now, as her life approached its final days, the sisters of the convent noticed a change in her, not less pain, but a softer glow beneath the suffering, an unmistakable peace that seemed to rise from a place far deeper than the body could ever reach. Rita had always been a woman of prayer, but in these last months, prayer became as natural to her as breathing. The rhythm of her days, morning light slipping through the window, the distant echo of the convent bells, the quiet footsteps of the sisters coming to check on her, wove itself into a tapestry of gentle anticipation. She no longer prayed for relief from her pain. She prayed only that her final hours would glorify God, that her last breaths would be offerings of love. She often folded her hands together, her weakened fingers tracing the shape of the cross, as though preparing her soul for the embrace of the Savior whose passion she had shared so intimately through her wound. The sisters gathered around her more frequently now, sensing that her time was drawing near. They tended to her with tenderness, adjusting her blankets, moistening her lips, reading aloud passages from Scripture or the writings of the saints. Rita listened with half-closed eyes, her expression serene, as though each word nourished her soul like a final meal before a long-awaited journey. At times she spoke in whispers, offering her gratitude to the sisters who had loved her through her suffering. She blessed them softly, reminding them that God sees every sacrifice offered in love, no matter how small. And to each one who approached her bed, she offered a gentle smile, a smile that carried the weight of a lifetime of forgiveness, patience, and surrender. The wound on her forehead remained open to the very end, but now it seemed almost transfigured. The sisters, who once struggled with the odor that accompanied it, noticed that in her final days the scent changed, becoming faint, then sweet, as though the suffering itself was being drawn into a higher mystery. They would later speak of this moment with awe, recalling how the room seemed to fill with a quiet fragrance, subtle but unmistakable, a sign that heaven was drawing near. During the last week of her life, Rita received the Eucharist with an intensity of devotion that moved everyone who witnessed it. She could no longer sit up easily, so the sisters propped her gently with pillows, arranging her frail body so that she could greet the host with reverence. When the priest entered her cell carrying the Blessed Sacrament, her face brightened with a light that seemed almost unearthly. She whispered words of adoration, her voice trembling with awe. The Eucharist had always been her strength, her anchor, her consolation through every trial. Now, as she prepared to leave the world, it became her viaticum, the bread for her final journey. After receiving communion, Rita would close her eyes and rest in silence, her lips moving in quiet prayer. The sisters believed she was speaking to Christ directly, surrendering each remaining breath into his hands. They sensed that she was no longer clinging to life, but letting go gently, like a leaf resigning itself to the wind. She spoke occasionally of heaven, not with fear or uncertainty, but with the longing of someone approaching home after a long, weary pilgrimage. It was during one tender moment, when a sister asked her gently if she had any final desires, that Rita offered a simple request. She wished only to be remembered as someone who loved God deeply and forgave everyone who ever harmed her. She said this without sadness, without regret. She knew that forgiveness had been her life's calling, the path through which God had shaped her soul. Her words left the sisters in tears, for they knew how many wounds she had carried. Wounds inflicted not only by life's tragedies, but by the cruelty and anger of others. And yet she forgave all of it, completely, silently, without holding a single grudge. As her strength faded further, Rita entered into a kind of holy stillness. Her breathing became softer, her movements few, but her eyes, when open, carried a depth of peace that made the sisters feel as though they were looking into the very heart of God's mercy. She seemed to exist now between two worlds, the earthly one that held her fragile body, and the heavenly one that was already welcoming her soul. Her suffering, once sharp and constant, seemed to dissolve into a quiet repose, as though Christ himself rested beside her, lifting the weight from her shoulders. On the night before her death, the sisters gathered in her cell to pray the litany of the saints. Candlelight flickered gently against the stone walls, casting soft shadows across the room. Rita listened to the names being read, holy men and women who had carried their own crosses, who had endured their own trials, who now lived in the eternal embrace of God. When they reached the name of St. Augustine, Rita's lips curved into a faint smile, recalling the saint who had guided her from the beginning. When they spoke the name of St. Nicholas of Tolentino, her eyes fluttered open slightly, as though she felt his presence near. And when they uttered the name of St. John the Baptist, whose fierce love for God had once inspired her, a tear slipped down her cheek. In the early morning hours, as dawn approached and birds began to stir outside the convent walls, Rita's breathing became slow and rhythmic, like the ebbing of a tide. The sisters stood in silence, surrounding her bed like a circle of vigil candles. And then, in a moment so gentle it felt almost like a sigh, Rita's spirit slipped from her body. There was no struggle, no fear, only peace, deep and soft, settling over the room like a blessing. The sisters later spoke of that moment as one of profound holiness. The wound on her forehead, which had bled and burned for years, suddenly healed, leaving only a faint trace, as though touched by divine mercy. Her body, so frail in life, now seemed relaxed, serene, unburdened. and the sweet fragrance that had filled her cell lingered long after her passing, a silent testament to the grace she carried. And so we continue from the sacred stillness of Rita's final breath, stepping gently now into the hours, days, and years that followed her passing. An unfolding of grace that revealed with serene clarity that death had not ended her story, but had only opened it into a new and luminous chapter. For the moment Rita's soul left her frail body, the convent was filled with signs that her life, marked for decades by sorrow and silent sacrifice, had blossomed into sanctity far more radiant than anyone had fully understood while she lived. What came after her death was not merely the respect given to a beloved sister, nor the natural mourning of a community that had grown to cherish her deeply, but the unmistakable fragrance of holiness that lingered in ways visible, tangible, and profoundly moving to all who witnessed it. The sisters who had kept vigil at her bedside were the first to notice the transformation. The wound on her forehead, open, painful, and malodorous for so many years, had healed completely at the moment of her death. Where once there had been a deep indentation, now there remained only a faint mark, delicate as a whispered memory. Her face, once drawn by illness, seemed suddenly serene and youthful, bearing an expression of peace that made the sisters weep softly in gratitude. And then there was the fragrance, subtle at first, then unmistakably sweet, as though the air itself had been perfumed by something not of this world. The strong odor that had long accompanied her thorn wound vanished, replaced by a scent reminiscent of fresh roses, of gardens touched by early morning dew. It spread gently across the room, filling the convent halls and drifting out into the courtyard. Those who entered her cell immediately recognized it as a silent assurance that Rita's suffering had been fully embraced by heaven. As news of her passing spread through Cascia and the surrounding villages, people began to gather at the convent to pay their respects. Many came simply because they had known her as a woman of remarkable gentleness. Others came because they had long heard whispers of her extraordinary patience, her compassion, her peacemaking miracles. Some came drawn by stories of the thorn wound, eager to see the saintly woman who had carried part of Christ's passion on her own body. But whatever brought them, they found themselves deeply moved by what they encountered. Rita's body, though lifeless, showed no sign of decay. Her skin remained smooth, her hands soft, her expression tranquil. Those who approached her felt a quiet warmth, a sense of being in the presence of something holy. Many knelt beside her bier and whispered prayers, asking for her intercession. Some wept openly, not out of despair, but out of awe. The miracles began almost immediately. People suffering from ailments touched her hands or garments and found themselves healed. A paralyzed child was brought into the chapel where her body lay, and after his parents prayed fervently beside her, he suddenly stood and began to walk. Another woman, long afflicted with a painful illness, felt an immediate release from her suffering upon touching Rita's veil. These events spread quickly by word of mouth, drawing pilgrims from farther regions. They came hoping for healing, for comfort, for signs of God's mercy made tangible through Rita's intercession. And many found what they sought. The sisters, overwhelmed by the steady stream of visitors and astonished by the miracles, knew they were witnessing the beginning of a devotion that would last far beyond their lifetimes. They carefully tended to her body, noting with reverent amazement that it remained incorrupt. Days after her death, weeks even, her body showed no signs of decomposition. Her limbs remained flexible. Her countenance seemed untouched by time. This phenomenon, recognized in the Church as a sign of extraordinary holiness, drew even more people to witness the marvel for themselves. Her coffin, placed in the chapel for veneration, became the center of prayer and contemplation. People left flowers, candles, handwritten petitions. The scent of roses continued to emanate from her body, a fragrance so persistent and sweet that many described it as otherworldly. It was as though the miracles of the rose and fig during her life, the winter rose blooming through snow, the ripe fig in barren season, now blossomed in a spiritual sense through her incorrupt remains. The rose became a symbol forever tied to her name, the Rose of Roccaporena, the saint of the impossible, the woman whose prayers turned winter into spring. As the years passed, devotion to Rita grew steadily. The stories of her life spread through Italy. Her troubled marriage, her courage as a mother, her impossible reconciliation of feuding families, her entrance into the convent through miraculous intervention, her thorn wound, her hidden suffering, her gentle death. Each part of her story resonated with people in different ways. Some saw in her a model of forgiveness. Others saw a comforter for those enduring domestic hardship. Others recognized her as a patron for impossible causes, since her own life had been sculpted from impossible circumstances, redeemed through grace. The Augustinian nuns preserved her body, now placed in a glass casket for veneration. Pilgrims traveled from distant lands to see her, to touch the marble of her tomb, to bring their sorrows and hopes to the woman who herself had known every form of suffering, yet had responded with unwavering faith. Some came seeking miracles, others came simply to be near her, believing that the peace she had found in death would touch their own lives. Over time, reports of healings, answered prayers, and extraordinary interventions multiplied. Mothers prayed for their children, spouses prayed for reconciliation, those trapped in difficult circumstances prayed for guidance and hope. Rita, who had lived her life as a quiet intercessor for the suffering, now became an intercessor for generations of the faithful. Churches dedicated to her began to appear. Altars bearing her image were erected. Devotions spread across borders. And everywhere, the symbol of the rose accompanied her, a simple flower that had once bloomed in the dead of winter as a sign of God's tenderness toward her. The sisters of the convent, who had known her personally, shared stories that filled the hearts of pilgrims with reverence. They spoke of her humility, her kindness, her tireless prayer, her unfaltering love. They spoke of the fragrance that filled her cell, the peace that accompanied her presence, the visions that guided her path. They spoke of the many ways she had healed hearts long before she healed bodies. And always, they spoke with gratitude. Gratitude for having witnessed a living saint walk among them. Gratitude for the grace that seemed to pour from her life, like light through a stained glass window. And so we continue from the fragrance of miracles that surrounded Rita's passing, stepping gently now into the centuries that followed, where her story, once confined to the quiet valleys of Umbria, began to echo across countries and continents, carried by the lips of the faithful who found in her life a reflection of their own impossible sorrows. For Rita, who had suffered more than most could bear, became after death not merely a memory cherished by her convent, but a beacon of hope to countless souls who discovered in her the patronage of the impossible. Her influence, born in silence and nourished through suffering, began to transcend time itself, awakening devotion in hearts that would never walk the cobbled paths of Cascia, nor kneel beside her earthly remains, yet would feel profoundly touched by her intercession. In the first decades after her death, the devotion began quietly, like a small flame spreading from wick to wick. Those who had witnessed miracles at her bier carried the stories home to their families. Mothers told their children of the saintly widow who had forgiven her husband's murderers. Soldiers whispered prayers to her before going into battle, trusting in her strength. Wives trapped in painful marriages sought comfort in the story of her patience. Parents grieving the loss of their children found solace in her tears. And those who believed that their suffering was too great for healing discovered in Rita a compassionate companion who had walked deeper valleys than most hearts could fathom. Word of her incorrupt body spread slowly at first, then with increasing fervor. Pilgrims began traveling to Cascia from distant regions of Italy, sometimes arriving exhausted, sometimes ill, sometimes on the verge of despair. They came with burdens too great for words: broken families, incurable illnesses, bitter feuds, financial ruin, impossible circumstances with no earthly solutions. They knelt before her casket, lit candles, whispered prayers, and returned home, carrying stories of unexpected peace, sudden healings, reconciliations that seemed humanly unreachable. The rose, which had bloomed out of season during her lifetime, became the symbol of her intercession, a sign that God could bring beauty out of barrenness, hope out of winter, life out of what seemed already lost. By the 17th century, devotion to Rita had grown so widespread that ecclesial recognition became inevitable. Her incorrupt body, still emitting a soft fragrance through the decades, drew the attention of church authorities. Witnesses testified not only to physical healings, but to profound conversions of heart, reconciliations between families locked in hatred, and unexpected solutions to long-standing conflicts, miracles that echoed the very themes of her life. In 1600, Rita was beatified by Pope Clement VIII, a formal acknowledgement of the sanctity that countless souls had already recognized. Her beatification was met with immense joy in Cascia, where processions filled the streets, bells rang through the valleys, and flowers, especially roses, were scattered along the roads leading to her shrine. Yet her story did not stop there. Nearly 350 years after her death, on May 24, 1900, Rita was officially canonized by Pope Leo XIII, becoming Saint Rita of Cascia. The Church now recognized her not only as a model of endurance and forgiveness, but as a powerful intercessor for the impossible. The Pope himself referred to her as the precious gem of Cascia, acknowledging that her life, marked by suffering, patience, reconciliation, and mystical union with Christ, held lessons for every generation. With her canonization, her feast day, May 22nd, was established, and devotion to her spread even more widely. Churches and chapels around the world dedicated altars to her memory. Statues of her holding a thorn or a rose began to appear in parishes across Europe, then in the Americas, Asia, and beyond. The world had discovered in Saint Rita a friend to the wounded, a hope for the hopeless, a companion for those carrying crosses they could not bear alone. Her patronage grew in ways that surprised even the Church. People prayed to her not only for miracles of the body, but for miracles of the heart. Families torn apart by conflict sought her intercession for reconciliation, recalling how she herself had healed a feud that had lasted generations. Those trapped in difficult marriages prayed for patience and strength, knowing she had endured years of suffering with grace. Individuals who carried bitterness in their hearts prayed for the courage to forgive those who had wounded them, inspired by her forgiveness of her husband's murderers. Mothers and fathers grieving children saw in her a mirror of their own pain, trusting that she would understand tears shed in silence. And countless individuals facing situations that seemed beyond human remedy, legal battles, financial collapse, spiritual crises, relationships on the verge of fragmentation, turned instinctively to her, the saint of the impossible, believing that she could lift their prayers to God with a tenderness shaped by her own experience of the impossible. The shrine in Cascia grew accordingly. What had begun as a humble convent chapel became, over time, a great basilica, its walls adorned with frescoes depicting scenes from her life. Pilgrims filled the space year after year, lighting thousands of candles whose soft glow mirrored the steady flame of hope she had carried throughout her earthly life. The sisters of the convent, now guardians of her legacy, welcomed visitors with hospitality and reverence, sharing stories passed down through generations. Some spoke of the fragrance that still occasionally emanated from her casket. Others shared testimonies of miracles sent to the convent from grateful pilgrims around the world. Letters detailing healings, reconciled marriages, unexpected blessings, hearts transformed. In time, devotion to Saint Rita became not only widespread but deeply personal. Many Catholic homes began placing statues or holy cards of her near sacred images of the Sacred Heart and the Blessed Mother. People prayed novenas to her, especially during times of despair or trial. Her name became synonymous with perseverance, with trust, with surrender to God's will even when that will seemed wrapped in sorrow. And always, the rose remained her enduring symbol, not merely because of the winter rose that bloomed in Roccaperena, but because her entire life mirrored the paradox of a flower blooming in impossible conditions. And so, as the centuries rolled forward, Saint Rita became not simply a figure from history, but a presence, gentle, compassionate, familiar, whose memory continues to guide souls toward peace. Everywhere she is known, she carries with her the essence of her own journey, a reminder that no suffering is meaningless, no wound beyond healing, no situation beyond the reach of God's transforming love.